what if, after we pass, we don't move on? Instead, what if we relive our final moments on repeat forever, time after time beyond time? Today, I have stories that feature the supernatural, the unexplained, and things that will damage your sanity if you were to ever encounter them. Prepare yourself for these 5 allegedly true scary stories featuring tragic ghosts, logic-defying monsters, and an especially creepy theme park in the woods. If you have a story of your own, be sure to share it with us at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. Now, let's begin. The Blonde Rider, from Mr. Smith. I can't claim to have experienced this set of events firsthand, as the story comes from my girlfriend, but I'll relate the details to you just as she related them to me. For the sake of ease, I'll be writing the story from her point of view, so bear with me and just imagine this coming from Miss Carmichael instead of Mr. Smith. Have you ever had a seemingly normal encounter that didn't set off any alarm bells until much later? Maybe a stranger stopped and asked you for directions to someone's house, or maybe you were behind somebody in line at the hardware store with a suspicious combination of items, and you just didn't realize how strange it was until later that evening. I think I had one such encounter recently. I own and operate a bakery in a small rural town, and I often cater for venues around the county. In June of this year, I was providing desserts and snacks for a fancy horseback riding event and reception at a local ranch and winery. The people that own the ranch winery are nice enough. They're old money from this area and are generally pretty nice people. However, their clientele is made up of very wealthy doctors and lawyers who insist on sending their little princesses there to learn how to ride horseback. It's those people that can sometimes be pretentious. Anyway, you get the point. Lots of white tablecloths and fine suits and dresses. The reception started around 2 o'clock on a blazing summer day, when it had gotten too hot to continue out on the track. But by 6 o'clock, I was getting tired from being on my feet all afternoon and having to run back and forth to the van. Things finally wound down around 8 p.m., and I was packing up the last of the food and serving dishes, getting ready to cart everything outside to pack up and leave. Just then, however, a young girl of about 15 or 16, with long and flowing blonde hair, approached the table where I was rounding things up. She stood out to me because she was wearing gray sweatpants and a Virginia Tech hoodie instead of an expensive dress or sport coat. She also kept her hoodie wrapped close around her, despite the sweltering heat of the North Carolina summer. Of course, plenty of people had been wearing wool suits that day, so stranger things have happened, I guess. She smiled at me and asked if there were any oatmeal cookies left. I rummaged in a few of my travel boxes for some. While I searched, she and I made small talk. I asked her if she planned on attending Virginia Tech, pointing to her hoodie. She nodded enthusiastically, and she happily told me about how much she hoped to get in at VT and join her equestrian team. Finally, I found a box of oatmeal cookies and asked her how many she wanted. She asked for 2, saying one was for her and the other was a special treat for the horse. I know absolutely nothing about horses, so I just nodded and said, "Well, enjoy." She thanked me with a smile and quietly walked back toward the doors of the reception hall. As she walked away, I looked back down and continued taking inventory, so I never saw her leave. I also never heard the huge double doors of the reception hall creak open as she exited the building. Nevertheless, next time I looked around, I was alone in the room. Like I said earlier, it seemed completely normal at the time, but looking back, she really stood out since she wasn't there with any adults or parents, and her clothing was drastically different from all the other guests. Less than 10 minutes later, I was loading the last of my supplies and dishes into the van, which was parked on the large lawn just next to the fenced-in area of soft dirt where the students rode their horses. Nobody else was there by that time except for a few other staff members and one or two stragglers. The evening air was pleasantly warm and calm, with a refreshing breeze blowing lightly through the manicured trees about the reception hall. I was just about to get into the driver's seat when suddenly, the twilight stillness was pierced by the frantic sounds of a distressed horse, along with the sounds of hooves stomping against the soft ground. Just moments later, the shrill sound of a woman screaming echoed across the fields, followed by a heavy thud and the sickening, unmistakable crunch of breaking bones. As quickly as my now shaking hands would let me, I fumbled to get my keys into the ignition slot of my van, cranking the engine, turning the headlights on bright to illuminate the corral in front of the van. However, as the glow of the headlights washed over the dirt, I saw nothing. No horses stood in the corral, and the ground was totally bare, with no trace of a wounded rider. It was just then that I realized that the night was again quiet, with none of the pained moaning one would expect after hearing bones cracking. As I sat there scanning the field confusedly, I felt a tap on my shoulder that made me practically jump out of my skin. When I turned around, I saw that it was only one of the ranch owners wearing an understandably concerned expression. She apologized for having frightened me and told me that she had just wanted to thank me for being so patient and helpful with all the guests that day. I fumbled my words as I tried to tell her it was no big deal, but she asked what had me so flustered. It was then that I realized she must not have heard the scream and the impact, so I suddenly became hesitant to say anything to her about it, since she would probably think I was crazy. Then again, something about the genuine concern on her face put me more at ease, so I told her what I had heard. She simply nodded calmly, then asked if I had seen a pretty young blonde dressed in full riding gear at the reception. Surprised by her candor, I shook my head and told her I hadn't, but then I remembered the girl in the hoodie. I must have seen 100 pretty young blondes that day, but only one stood out in my memory. I described the blonde's height and features to the ranch owner, and she smiled softly, like she was recalling a pleasant memory. I must have had quite the perplexed look on my face, because the woman quickly began to explain. The owner informed me that about 15 years ago, a girl named Molly had been the star pupil of the ranch. Unlike some of the rich kids that viewed their riding lessons with indifference, Molly had a genuine dedication to horses and a passion for horseback riding. She hoped to go on to pursue riding professionally after getting a degree in business. One evening in late November, however, Molly had stayed late to practice, and she had continued to ride until almost sundown despite there being a strict no riding past dark rule at the ranch. As she was cantering her horse back towards the stables, something had spooked it, possibly a coyote in the nearby tree line. The horse then rose onto its hind legs in a panic. Since Molly had been on her way back to the stables, she had unstrapped her riding helmet already, and when she had fallen from the back of her horse, she had landed with all her weight on her neck. She died instantly. Several people witnessed the event from up the hill, and they all rushed to her aid, but she was already dead. However, to hear several of the ranch staff tell it, she may have died, but she didn't move on. Occasionally, especially at crowded events or late at night, people would report seeing a passionate young blonde cantering along in the corral or feeding the horses in the stables. And apparently I wasn't the first to hear the phantom scream at sundown. It was a lot to take in, and I still had plenty to do that evening, so I simply thanked the woman for giving me the job and headed on my way. However, as I drove towards the front gate of the ranch, I could have sworn I saw the same blonde teenager from earlier in the evening sitting on the fence. She was dressed in riding gear, but she wore no helmet. She waved at me as I rounded the final curve in the long winding driveway. I quickly backed up and swept my headlights along the same section of fence again, but this time, there was nothing there. I haven't been back there since, but I've been asked to cater another event at the ranch in September, and every time I drive past there around sundown, I can't help but slow down and look for a glimpse of the blonde rider. After the storm, from East Wind. I live in northern Indiana, just a short drive from the shores of Lake Michigan. I've seen a lot of questionable things around here, from huge black dogs with glowing eyes to a mysteriously hooded man with arcane symbols tattooed all over his body. The Midwest is no stranger to strangeness. It can be found underneath the streetlights in our suburbs, amongst the endless rows of corn in our fields, or in a deserted drugstore in the middle of the night. My story takes place on the beach of Lake Michigan, which is part of the Indiana Dunes National Park. We've got woods, swamps, bogs, and sandy beaches all within a short drive of one another. I like to take nature pictures, and I often drive the back roads that border the swamps and woods, looking for interesting locations. One particular day, I decided to park my car and walk along the beach. It was late summer, early fall. Our area recently had a round of several strong storms. This made me hopeful that I'd find new things to photograph. Maybe the winds had downed some trees, or maybe I'd find something interesting washed up on shore. I walked along the beach, just out of range of the water, as I didn't want to get my shoes wet. I took pictures of dune grass, waves, and an adorable puppy that was enjoying the beach with its owners. Soon I came upon a stretch of the beach without anyone on it. I briefly wondered why there wasn't anyone around, but it was then that I smelled it. A strong odor of fish and rot so putrid that I was instantly nauseous. I pulled my t-shirt up over my nose and gagged. I was about ready to turn around and call it a day when I saw a strange pattern in the sand coming from the water's edge. It was as if something had dragged itself from the water. Perhaps I could have explained it as an injured animal or something, but then I saw handprints. They were similar to a child's handprint, and they were on either side of the drag mark. I got a funny feeling in the pit of my stomach when I saw this, but I was hoping that it was just a kid on his boogie board, pulling himself across the sand and having fun. I followed the drag mark and handprints away from the water and toward a thick patch of dune grass. As I followed the markings, the foul smell got stronger. As I drew closer to the grass, I had to put a lot of effort into not getting sick from the stench. I stepped into the waist-high grass and looked around, parting it and scanning the sandy ground. I didn't see anything, so I softly called out, "Hello? Anybody around?" There wasn't a reply. I turned around, but then stopped. There before me was the most disturbing thing I'd ever laid eyes on. It was a 4-foot-long, slimy gray-colored creature, almost humanoid. It lay there on the sand on its belly, reaching for me with human-like arms and small webbed fingers. Its mouth was agape, gasping, with thin, rigid lips. The creature was pale, almost translucent, skin stretched tight across its face. It looked at me with inky, black eyes. I screamed and fell backwards into the grass as it swiped the top of my foot with a clammy, cold hand. A raspy, wet sound came from its opened mouth, and its whole body shivered. It looked sick. It pulled itself along with its arms inching closer to me and dragging its back half, which didn't end in a tail or legs, but just simply ended like it was some horrifically unfinished abomination. I scrambled to my feet and was able to sidestep away from the thing with a couple of jumps. I then ran away down the length of the beach. I must have scared several beachgoers when they saw me speed by with such a look of terror on my face. I didn't stop until I got to my car and locked myself inside. My chest was pounding, my throat was dry, my stomach was now threatening to get sick from my panicked running. My mind was reeling as it shot down one explanation after another. I had seen pictures of mysterious dead creatures washed up on beaches before, but I've never seen anything quite like this, let alone still alive. It was about that time, as I sat in my car calming down, that I realized that I couldn't find my camera. I laughed, shook my head. I was sure that I dropped it when I fell, and there was no way I was going back to get it. That was 3 years ago. I haven't told anyone about this unknown hideous creature until now. I still drive by that area, taking passing pictures. I'm still fond of the special kind of creepiness that can only be found in the Midwest, but now I have a new rule to follow. Don't go walking the beaches after a bad storm has stirred up the lake, because you never know what you might find. A Conversation in the Mojave, from Usagi. I live in the Mojave Desert region of Southern California, an hour or so from the Arizona border. I'm Wiccan, and love the challenge of performing my religion in a climate and seasonal cycle very different from the one our religious year was based on. I often take camping trips into the desert, to be alone with my faith and with nature, taking nothing but proper backpacking supplies and tools that I'd need for whatever ritual I'm choosing to work with. This story took place on one such retreat. I set out the day before Belkina, the ritual Sabbat marking the entry into summer. I found a wonderful spot in the wilderness and set up camp. I'd settled on a solitary performance of a high circle, basically intending to perform the core elements of a Belkina ritual for one. I'll spare you the details in full, of course, but suffice to say I marked a sacred circle, set up an altar space, and made the appropriate food, cornbread cakes, and drinks, mulled hot cider. Then I made my prayers to the deities. I was in the midst of this prayer when I began to notice it was unreasonably cold. Don't get me wrong, the Mojave high desert can grow terribly chilly at night, but it was still pleasantly warm when I'd begun my prayers. Yet as I was reaching the high point of my working, my skin went so cold that my ears began to ache as if it were the middle of winter. I began to hear something, a faint brushing and crunching, as if something were approaching from the desert. I looked around, and at first I saw nothing. I believed it might have been a coyote, so I decided to end the ritual early in case it was trying to check out my food, or even me. That's when I finally saw it. At the edge of the light of my small, carefully contained ritual fire stood an animal. It had the rough shape of a person standing on 2 legs, yet it was all wrong. The limbs were twisted, out of proportion to one another. It leaned forward like a beast prepared to move. Fur covered its hands and forearms, and its face was similarly furred, ending in what looked like a muzzle. And it had teeth. I could tell, because it seemed to be grinning at me. Not the threatening snarl of bared fangs, but an amused and contemptuous grin. It looked for all the world like a parent watching a child pretend at their folks' jobs. My heart was hammering in my chest. What in the world was this thing? What did it want with me or with my circle? Had I offended it in some way? As if it could hear this train of thought, I heard laughter, a distorted, wet sound of disdainful amusement, and then it spoke to me.
You are a pretender.
I shook at the sound of its voice. It was so thick and so wrong-sounding. It sounded like it was speaking through heavy, wet cloth. "Leave me alone," I said. It heaved another of those laughs and walked right up to the edge of my circle. I almost backed away in a panic, but it stopped at the edge. Had my circle held it back? Or was it coincidence?
Pray then, but know that you pray and live on my sufferance.
I couldn't reply now. I couldn't bring myself to move, to respond, or even breathe, as the thing loomed at the edge of my circle, its stinking breath washing over my face. It stood there for a time, staring me down. Finally, it chuckled once more and began to walk back into the desert. I stood there shaking until it vanished, and then, when I couldn't see it anymore, I began to pack my things. I wouldn't stay there a second longer, but that's when I saw the worst thing of all. Right where I'd marked the eastmost portion of the circle, the thing's clawed footprint stood straddling the ritual line. It hadn't been outside my circle at all, but had stepped right onto it. In a tearful, shaking mess, I threw everything into my car, covered my fire in sand, and drove back home, panting for breath the entire way. I don't know exactly what it was. I've heard that Skinwalkers are corrupted Amerindian witches and enjoy causing fear and profaning sacred spaces, but I never heard they had an interest in European religious practices, and I'm a long drive from any sort of Navajo traditionally lived land, which is where I've heard Skinwalkers most frequent. I haven't been back to practice prayers in the open desert since, but curiosity is a hell of a thing. Drumming in the Forest, from Anonymous. I'm a security officer, and I work at a chemical plant in the middle of the Trail of Tears in southern Tennessee. These events happened not too long ago while I was on patrol. Part of the patrol requires me to step out of the truck and unlock a large metal gate. On each side is about 100 yards of marshy flat land, and across the street is the forest's edge. As I stepped out of the truck to unlock this gate, I began to hear this odd, metallic drum beat, like tunk, 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 tunk. The beat started out slowly as I stopped to listen. It was when the beat began to speed up rapidly that I realized that the nearby woods were dead silent except for this beat. I ran to the gate and opened it, bolting back to my truck as fast as I could. As I started to drive off, the drumming then stopped. But 15 minutes later, as I was driving in another area, I was again listening to the frogs croaking from a nearby pond, when suddenly, along with the croaks, the drumming started up again. The frogs kept croaking. I took out my phone, and since the video footage can get you fired, I started using the voice recording tool on my phone. After 30 seconds, I drove off, and again, as I started to move, the tunk noise stopped. When I went back to listen to the 30-second clip, the only noise that played back was a high-pitched squeal, as if the recording malfunctioned. It was like metal grinding on metal. I decided to put this behind me and finish my patrol before going back to the office. After parking, I walked down the road and stopped dead in my tracks. From the grassland, I heard the most blood-curdling shriek, a mix between a woman's scream, a fox howl, and something metal, something that I could not identify. I spent the remainder of the night sitting in the office, nervously looking down the unlit road into the darkness in the forest, hoping that I didn't see anything reveal itself, because whatever made those sounds, it's not something that exists naturally on this planet. Creature in the Theme Park, from Lorenzoproject. I live in the UK in a small town in Nottinghamshire. We're surrounded by forests and a canal. I'm 23. I was taking a stroll through the woods. It was after dinner, around 7 p.m., and there was still some light left in the sky. I was taking the main road that cuts through the woods. The further in you go, the quieter it gets out there, until it's nothing but birds singing. The sounds of the cars in the distance fade away. It's nice, though it can be quite eerie. In these woods, there's an old theme park called American Adventure. It was built in a clearing, with either side being a car park. But in recent months, work had been done on the land to build new houses and homes all around. As I'm walking past the gated area, everything seemingly closed down and empty, I notice someone who seems to notice me. The guy is tall and has a worn face and a slender body. His complexion is pale. He walks over to me and says, "Hey, you don't want to be down here at night, kid." I replied, annoyed that he called me kid. "I'm just taking a walk down to the pond, 10 minutes away from here." I power walked away, wondering if he worked here. He didn't look like he did, and if that was the case, why was he here? I kept on walking, and after a few minutes my mind settled down. I thought nothing of the guy, assuming he was either drunk or trying to steal something. Anyway, I made it to the pond and had a nice walk around, and even sat on a bench for a while, taking in the breeze and catching my breath. By then it was around 8:30. It was beginning to get dark, so I decided to take a different route home and walk on the other side of the gated theme park. It may be a bit slower, but hopefully I wouldn't see that man again. I took it steady anyway, taking my time because I knew the house would be loud when I got back. It's always a ruckus back there, so I tend to savor my alone time. I made it back to the theme park area, and as I'm walking past, I hear a loud, human-like scream. It was ear-piercing, felt like it was stinging my eardrums, and it gave me chills on my arms. The scream comes several times in a matter of a few seconds. Then the last one seemed quieter, like the pain was easing from the person who was screaming. Then, to my surprise, it was all followed up by a howl coming from the same direction. A howl coming from deep within something's stomach. When I heard this, I was astounded. My feet seemed to stick to the ground as I listened. I couldn't move for a moment. Then again, I wasn't even thinking about moving. All I could think about was what was making these sounds. And then I remembered the man. What if he had hurt himself out there in the theme park somewhere? Maybe got himself crushed and was calling out in pain. Maybe he was as drunk as I thought. But there was nothing I could do out here. I had to get back home. That's where my phone was. And for some reason, that last howl didn't sit well with me. So I began to jog now, trying to get back home faster than before. I was shaking, and my forehead was drenched with sweat. As I was running, I heard a noise behind me, a sort of thud, something hitting hard on the ground. I turned in an instant to see a dark figure behind a tree, no less than 30 meters away. Standing behind it, peeking out, sort of hugging the tree, I saw something that I have trouble explaining. There were claws wrapped around the tree, claws with black skin and gray hair. I could see partial bits of a stomach, and whatever these parts belonged to, I could hear it growl at me, a sound that shook me to my core and had me running away in a split-second bolt before I could even decide to move. My body was working on its own to escape with my life. I was soon close to the main road again. I could hear the traffic coming up. When I broke through the tree line, I nearly got hit by a family van, but I made it to the other side okay. Only then, when the traffic and the road separated me from the tree line, did I look back. I saw nothing. No black skin or gray fur or long claws. I took the chance to run faster than before, even though I was ready to collapse from exhaustion. I got home, took a shower, tried to settle down my heart rate, then tried to tell my mother about what I saw. But seeing her expression, I twisted my statement and said that I was just joking around about it. That night, I made sure the windows were sealed shut, and I slept with the nightlight on for the first time in years. What in the world did I encounter out there? What kind of animal or cryptid matches that description here in the UK, especially in Nottinghamshire? To this day, I hope I was just seeing things, and that guy from before just had me on edge. There's no escape from the strangeness of this world. You're better off hoping that you, by chance, don't run into something bizarre and life-altering in your lifetime. Because sanity is a terrible thing to lose, and there are things that exist in our world that would be happy to tear it from you. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. If you want to support the show, check the links below for my Patreon, my merch store, and a link to Acorns where you can get started investing while helping me out at the same time. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode, titled, Don't Stop at Morris Hill. 6 True Scary Stories. Kling Amarth says, Chilling. Aw, Kling, if you're cold, dude, you can just wear my skin. Sadly, I've got plenty of it. Speak of the Devil, No Need says, I stopped my workout for this. I'm naming my next fat roll after you, Darkness. I would be flattered and fattered. Dubco says, still not in the first 5. Oh well, scary stories will suffice. Keep in mind, I don't pick the first 5, I pick the first early comments that actually interest me. You got me to reply, so you win. Security9886 says, so we should totally connect. You should watch some of my videos. You can get some pretty good stories from my job as a security officer in Savannah. I'm getting a lot of security officer stories as of late, but I'm a huge fan of those stories. I'll check out your channel, and if you've got a story to share, go to darkstories.org, because according to the views on my channel, people love security officer stories. And Gato Dogcat says, the hill is my home. If it's Morris Hill, then you apparently live in hell. But to each his own. Home is where the heart bleeds. Or how does that go? Anyway, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my creepy, amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.